Are you coming into tea, son?
I'll right along.
The 39 Steps, the most famous manhunt in all of fiction, the first truly modern spy novel.
The first and the best. It's one of the greatest thrillers ever written.
The appeal lies in the sheer storytelling ability. It is, in his argot, a ripping good yarn.
It's been filmed 3 times since its publication in 1915. It's never gone out of print and still sells some 10,000 copies per year.
You are there, you're on the hillside. You're being chased by the monoplane. You're clinging onto the train or whatever it is across the bridge.
The novel's hero, Richard Hannay, became an icon. The courageous gentleman adventurer, upholding British values of decency and empire.
Well, Richard Hannay is an enduring character simply because we all want to be Richard Hannay. Do you want to be James Bond? Yes, you do. Do you want to be Richard Hannay? Yes, you do.
The 39 Steps and Richard Hannay were just part of a body of work by John Buchan, who became the founding father of the all-action modern spy and an accompanying gallery of gung-ho adventurers.
You know, there are moments when you're at the blackest pit, when suddenly in comes the person you think is going to be the torturer, and then suddenly he whips off his turban and pulls off the mask, and whoa, it's Sandy Arbuthnot from school.
But beyond Buchan's daring do lie deeper undercurrents. His thrillers reflect the growing fault lines of a rapidly changing world.
There's far more to John Buchan than Boy's Own style adventures. They're about human weakness, they're about human wickedness, they're about the appropriate responses, they're about the triumph of good. There's a great deal more there than just swashbuckle.
In 1938, 2 years before his death, John Buchan sat for the famous portrait photographer, Yusef Kosh. Today, this one severe image and one exciting story, the 39 Steps, are all that most people would recognize of Buchan. Yet he was one of the most celebrated men of his time. From a modest Scottish Presbyterian background, he rose to be Governor-General of Canada. Alongside his public career, he produced a staggering range of books. Biographies, short stories, poetry, historical and supernatural novels, which went well beyond the thriller.
People are often surprised when I tell them that he wrote a great many more books than that, and some better. They won't have that.
But it's for the thrillers that Buchan is remembered. And at their heart is an enigma. The figure of the austere, dutiful public servant who inspired a century of British spy fiction.
I mean, on the surface, there's an incompatibility, isn't there, between Buchan, the very uptight, hard-working, quiet, personally rather unassuming Scot, and the secret agent character, Richard Hannay.
John Buchan was born in 1875 in Perth, where his father was a Free Church minister. The family soon moved to Fife and then Glasgow.
He himself, in his memoirs, said he grew up with a very, very powerful sense of sin. You know, and the sin isn't out there, it's within. Just beneath the surface of Buchan is this sense of sin.
The person who instilled this sense was not Buchan's father, a dreamy, reflective man, but his mother, Helen. She wanted John to go into the church. But even then, the young Buchan was caught between scholarship and adventure.
Father's parish is a very poor district, and Buchan teaches in the Sunday school. At the same time, the summer holidays are spent in Tweeddale, running almost wild, playing war games with his brothers.
The great place of refuge for Buchan, I think really right through his life, is the borders, is the security of this maternal family home with an extended family of cousins. He's able to relax there in a way he perhaps can't at home. One could say that the cities reflect a more corrupt lifestyle. There's menace in the cities, whereas there's almost a self-renewing element in the country. And I suppose everyone is equal in nature.
Wood, sea and hill were the intimacies of my childhood, and they've never lost their spell for me. But the spell of each was different. The woods and beaches were always foreign places, in which I was at best a sojourner. But the border hills were my own possession, a countryside in which my roots went deep.
You cannot read Buchan without being able to smell the heather, without being able to feel your feet going into a peat bog. You just can't do it. I mean, the descriptions of Scotland, the chases that take place over its moorland, the panting uphill, people riding horses across the moors and coming upon remote houses, all this sort of thing. Buchan knew. I mean, Buchan did.
In the 39 Steps, there's a passage which I read when I'm lecturing as an illustration of how to do descriptions of landscape. I sat down on the very crest of the pass and took stock of my position. To left and right were round-shouldered green hills as smooth as pancakes, but to the south there was a glimpse of high, heathery mountains. In the meadows below the road, half a mile back, a cottage smoked, but it was the only sign of human life. Otherwise, there was only the calling of plovers and the tinkling of little streams. There was no cover for a tomtit in those bald green places.
Buchan's Scottish roots and love of its countryside would always mark him, however high he rose.
Everyone sees him as a consummate insider, a member of the establishment. I see him writing more about moorland heroes than clubland heroes. He was always an outsider. He was the Scotsman in England.
Buchan was no public schoolboy. His parents couldn't afford that. But he did win a scholarship to Hutcheson's Grammar School in Glasgow. Then a further scholarship took him to Glasgow University.
He's obviously bright kid from a lower middle class background. But in those days, university was the place where those bright kids acquired the polish that they needed if they were actually going to enter the establishment.
Glasgow University, he worked very hard indeed. I mean, one of the things about Buchan is that, work is good. That's part of the thing. You've got to justify your existence. Work is good.
In 1895, Buchan, now aged 20, won a third scholarship to Brasenose College, Oxford, the final staging post for the grammar school boy on the make. He was introduced to a circle of aristocratic friends who would shape his career. Among them, Raymond Asquith, the brilliant son of the future Prime Minister, the poet Hilaire Belloc, and the adventurer Aubrey Herbert.
He fell in love with Oxford and, in a sense, probably with the English upper classes as well.
But what one's struck by is these are all high achievers, and they're all-rounders. They're people who get firsts, who play for the university rugby team or box the university. So these heroes that he creates later on are actually the people he's met at Oxford. It's not something that comes out of his imagination.
Buchan's friends were wealthy. He was not. There was no rich father to pay his bills.
Buchan had to earn money. He published 5 books while he was an undergraduate. He was quite remarkable. So, in a sense, of course, this confirmed him in the belief that, of his abilities. The fact that he could support himself, he could live on equal terms with these people.
While at Oxford, Buchan drew up this extraordinary list of honours already gained and to be gained. He could already cross off collections of essays, the Newdigate Prize for English verse, and novels like John Burnet of Barnes. To come were further prizes, and books he already had in mind. By the time he left Oxford, aged 24, Buchan had even secured an entry in Who's Who. Under occupation, his entry read, simply undergraduate. In 1901, Buchan left Britain for the first time. The Boer War in South Africa had been raging for almost 2 years, as the independent Boer republics refused to submit to British colonial rule. The guerrilla tactics employed by the Boers had proved devastatingly effective. But by 1901, the British had recovered, and the war was all but over. Buchan was introduced by an Oxford contact to Lord Milner, the British High Commissioner in South Africa, who offered him a job as his private secretary.
Well, he was put in as one of a group, the Milner kindergartens, they were known, to clean up the place after the mess that among them Milner had got into after the war with the Boers, which of course was one that greatly humiliated the British.
Buchan was brought face to face with the brutality of the Boer War.
There had been the appalling business of the concentration camps, in which Boer women and children were literally concentrated, but sanitation collapsed. That's the thing. There was an appalling death rate. About 20,000 died.
Despite these horrors, Buchan fell in love with South Africa, both the people and the landscape.
Once in a poem, a dedicatory poem in one of the books, he speaks of the fairest country under the stars, and that was South Africa.
Many of his characters are South African, like Peter Pienaar and Richard Hannay. That's very interesting that these outsiders. They're not members of the British establishment.
In South Africa, Buchan started writing what would become his first truly successful novel, Prester John. The story tells of a young Scottish man, David Crawford, who struggles to prevent an educated and charismatic black man, John Laputa, from leading an indigenous revolt.
Prester John's a very ambiguous novel. It's the chief literary coming of his South African experiences. Prester John, however, is a novel which does seem to look forward to a black Africa. And ultimately, the figure of John Laputa is a heroic figure. He's even given the last lines of Antony, in Antony of Cleopatra, when he dies.
Unarm, Eros, the long day's task is done.
While in his fiction, Buchan allowed himself to articulate the African desire for independence, he himself had no doubts of the white man's role.
I think his experience in the Boer War gave him a very strong commitment to empire. I mean, he was a great imperialist, was Buchan. And that suffuses all his novels. I mean, Richard Hannay himself has an imperial background. After all, Richard Hannay had spent his youth in South Africa.
I mean, John Buchan wrote, when Britain, though not quite at the top and beginning to go downhill, still felt itself at the top, and where people like Buchan, deadly serious in their hearts, thought that that was where we deserved to be, provided we behaved according to certain rules. And this comes through in the stories, comes through in his political life. It was part of him. He was a deeply serious, patriotic man at a time when Britain was quite different from what it is today.
If Buchan's time in Africa had inspired him, it also disturbed him. His experiences of the Boer War alerted him to the growing fault lines in the old order, which would provide an important motif in his thrillers.
I think that he felt this was an example of the enemy within, that although the British population of South Africa, the English-speaking population, was quite large, there was another substantial section of the community there, namely the Dutch-speaking one, who did not hold the same loyalties, although they lived in South Africa, did not hold the same loyalties as the English-speaking sections.
After his 2-year adventure in South Africa, Buchan returned home, keen to put down roots. Characteristically, he wasted little time in doing so. He was invited by Tommy Nelson, an Oxford friend, to join the family publishing firm. And he married into the aristocracy, his bride, Susan Grosvenor, a cousin of the Duke of Westminster. There were soon 2 children, Alice, born in 1908, and John, born in 1911. While Buchan cemented his place in the English establishment, Europe was beginning to fracture, mirroring the cracks within empire which Buchan had observed firsthand in South Africa. The ugly clashes within old and new worlds brought new protagonists who began to ignite Buchan's imagination.
Really, at the beginning of the 20th century, people are becoming aware of spies and espionage. They really make their first appearance in invasion novels, which was a genre of novel which took hold in Britain after the Franco-Prussian War and with the rise of Germany.
The German scare had been brilliantly exploited in a revolutionary thriller, The Riddle of the Sands, by Erskine Childers, in which 2 men on a boating holiday stumble across plans for a German invasion of Britain.
With The Riddle of the Sands, which was published in 1903, Childers wrote a type of book that had never been written before. It was a story which was entirely driven by suspense. The principal characters were in danger almost from the start, and the book ended more or less when they got out of danger. That's the definition of a novel of suspense. And The Riddle of the Sands was the first.
In creating a novel of suspense, Childers reinvented the adventure story in a new and nerve-tingling way, where constant jeopardy and menace drove the narrative. The threat Childers introduced, a German invasion, was further exploited by William Tufnell Le Queux.
He is really a writer of very poor quality, Le Queux. His books sold well because they were sensational. They warned people of the threat from Germany.
Le Queux wrote that 5,000 German spies, controlled directly from Berlin, were secretly operating in Britain. His books were popular but paranoid.
German spies in Britain were mostly myth. But given the anxieties of the Edwardians, they were seen as an enormous threat and challenge. And when William Le Queux wrote his book Spies of the Kaiser, he was flooded with letters from people saying, I've seen German spies. I mean, after all, there was a German population in Britain. Many of them were waiters, perfectly innocent people. But, of course, in times of anxiety, as we well know, it's very easy to project onto foreigners or people who are different than yourselves these tremendous fears.
This new type of novel, and the threat of a changing world order, jolted Buchan into action. In 1913, he wrote his first thriller, The Powerhouse, published as a serialization for Blackwood's magazine. It gave the world Buchan's first truly three-dimensional character, Edward Leithen, who was largely modelled on Buchan himself, and would reappear in a number of later adventures.
I mean, Leithen is a very hard-working, slightly dull barrister, but a man of tremendous compassion. You can't imagine Leithen being nasty to anybody.
In The Powerhouse, the megalomaniac villain, who passes himself off as an English gentleman while actually trying to undermine the country, taunts Leithen with the chaos he can inflict on the world.
Did you ever reflect, Mr. Leithen, how precarious is the tenure of the civilization we boast about? I should have thought it fairly substantial, I said, and the foundations grow daily firmer. He laughed. That is the lawyer's view, but believe me, you are wrong. Reflect and you will find that the foundations are sand. You think that a wall as solid as the earth separates civilization from barbarism.
I tell you that the division is a thread, a sheet of glass. A touch here, a push there, and you bring back the reign of Saturn.
It's the first one where you have this thing about the crust of civilization, Leithen's realization of, how you could disappear under the ice, in a sense, be dragged down very easily.
I do think he put his finger on something that has remained a very powerful theme of spy fiction and makes us keep turning the page because we need to know who the traitor within is. I mean, at one point, these things were very sure of a British gentleman could be trusted. We could trust people of our own nationality. We can't trust them now. We cannot trust them now.
8 months after the serialization of the powerhouse, war broke out in Europe. The crack in civilization of which Leithen had been warned was real. Buchan, now aged 39, immediately tried to join the army, but was rejected on the grounds of age and ill health. He was suffering from a duodenal ulcer that would plague the latter part of his life.
A combination of family anxieties and public activities had played havoc with my digestion. So I went to bed for the best part of 3 miserable months, while every day brought news of the deaths of my friends.
Depressed, frustrated, and bored, Buchan turned his attention to writing the novel that would make his name.
Don't you understand? The peace of the world is in danger now.
6 months later, just before the publication of the 39 Steps, Buchan described to his friend, Tommy Nelson, how the novel had come about.
My dear Tommy, you and I have long cherished an affection for that elementary type of tale which Americans call the dime novel, and which we know as the shocker. The romance where the incidents defy the probabilities and march just inside the borders of the possible. During my illness last winter, I exhausted my store of these aids to cheerfulness and was driven to write one for myself.
Despite Buchan's modest claim of mere escapism, his spy novel allowed him to articulate his fears about the modern world. In so doing, he perfectly captured the zeitgeist.
It's a timeless book. It's about the man on the run, right back to Odysseus. But of course, at the same time, it's very much of its time. This paranoia, war has just broken out, this idea that the spies are still there and what could they be doing, that the establishment has been subverted.
I need sanctuary for perhaps 24 hours. Can you help?
In the 39 Steps, Richard Hannay stumbles over a plot to assassinate the Greek Prime Minister.
My information convinces me that on the 15th of this month, an attempt will be made to assassinate Charalides.
The Greek Premier?
Yes, but...
Hannay is told of the plot by a mysterious spy named Scudder, who seeks refuge in his apartment. Scudder's information is all carefully catalogued in his encrypted notebook.
My research is all in here, Mr. Hannay. I need time to collate it.
But then, Scudder is found murdered on Hannay's floor.
You know, you've got a few enigmatic clues and a book, and then you come back to find this character who's given you these clues sprawled dead in your flat, and you're suddenly under surveillance, and you're right in there.
Hannay realises that both the police and whoever did that are going to be on to him. So he decides to disappear, but chooses to disappear not in London, which would be the obvious place you'd think, but to go up to Scotland.
He's remarkably inept, actually. You know, he's on the run, and where does he decide to hide out? On the barren, open hills of Scotland, where, of course, you can spot anything, a mile away.
But sending Hannay to the borders took Buchan into the landscape he loved and knew best.
My stratagem had given me a fair start, call it 20 minutes, and I had the width of a glen behind me before I saw the first heads of the pursuers. They hallooed at the sight of me, and I waved my hand. 2 dived into the glen and began to climb my ridge, while the others kept their own side of the hill. I felt as if I were taking part in a schoolboy game of hare and hounds.
Ah, well, he's disguised as a tramp.
Buchan had introduced 2 powerful new themes in spy fiction: the idea of the hunter becoming the hunted, and the illusion of safety in familiar surroundings.
Graham Greene once said of Buchan's novels that he thought they were so powerful and had been so important to the genre because Buchan had put his finger on one important thing, that nothing was ever quite what it seemed. So the man wearing the police uniform might not actually be a policeman, he might be an enemy.
Pursued both by agents of the sinister German spy network, the Black Stone, and by the police, Hannay must avoid capture, all the while attempting to unravel and foil a conspiracy to steal British naval secrets. The novel culminates on the Kent coast, where the German spies intend to leave the country at high tide from a staircase in the cliffs, a staircase with 39 steps.
The end comes in a sort of massive denouement. The end comes, good prevails, the baddies get their comeuppance, and Hannay is the hero.
The 39 Steps was published in October 1915. For British readers, subdued by the mounting losses on the Western Front, it was a welcome antidote. For Buchan, an astonishing commercial success. 25,000 copies were sold in the first 3 months. Buchan later recalled,
"I had no purpose in such writing except to please myself, and even if my books had not found a single reader, I would have felt amply repaid."
After writing the 39 Steps, Buchan moved back from fiction to fact. He embarked on a massive history of the war for his publishing company, Nelson's. Then he landed a job as a war correspondent for the Times. But a few months after he arrived in France, he was invited by the British commander, General Haig, to join his intelligence staff.
He's walking the corridors of power, he's seeing how power operates. It's a great inspiration for him as a writer.
Somehow, Buchan managed to find time to write another thriller, Greenmantle. It brought back Richard Hannay, now a major commanding a battalion on the Western Front.
There's no question that the development of Richard Hannay from book to book to some extent follows John Buchan's rise through the ranks of English society. In the 39 Steps, Richard Hannay is very much an outsider. He's a little bit chippy. But it doesn't last long, and I'm sure Buchan felt a little bit this way about English society.
Greenmantle includes some old friends from the 39 Steps, but it also introduces a range of new characters.
I gave Hannay certain companions, Peter Pienaar, a Dutch hunter, Sandy Arbuthnot, and an American gentleman, Mr. John S. Blenkiron. It was huge fun playing with my puppets, and to me they soon became very real, flesh and blood.
Hannay doesn't thrust himself forward as a sort of James Bond figure, completely self-centred. On the contrary, he's rather the person around whom other people, more exciting people, cluster. That works rather well, I think. And that's why it's lasted rather longer than perhaps Bond will.
Sandy Arbuthnot is an old Etonian adventurer who immersed himself completely in Middle Eastern culture, and sometimes dress.
Come to think of it, though, I do recall one example. A guru lived at the foot of the Shanzi Pass as you go over to Kaikand.
If he's not your favourite Buchan character after Greenmantle, then you must have missed a bit. He's fantastic.
John Blenkiron is an American spy who works for the British government. He seems to have been based on an American newspaperman Buchan knew. His duodenal ulcer and love of playing patience are both drawn directly from Buchan himself.
In fact, Blenkiron in some ways is almost more British than Hannay and Sandy, which is odd for an American that he should be fighting for the British Empire, but that's how Buchan painted him.
Hannay's oldest and most trusted friend was the Boer hunter, Peter Pienaar.
He was the man that taught me all I ever knew of Veldcraft, and a good deal about human nature besides. He was prospector, transport rider, and hunter in turns, but principally hunter.
In Greenmantle, Sir Walter Bullivant of the Foreign Office recalls Hannay from the front and issues him with a new set of orders.
Now, you may wonder why Turkey was dragged into this war against England.
Hannay is to gather his friends and undertake a dangerous mission through Germany and into the Middle East. At the heart of the mystery is the enigmatic prophet called Greenmantle.
And he's told that the Germans have found some means, nobody quite understands what means, of inciting the Arab nations into a jihad, a holy war against the Allies.
The adventure culminates in Turkey, where Hannay, Sandy and the others find themselves caught up in the Russian campaign to take Erzurum.
We came to destroy Greenmantle and your devilish ambitions. Make no mistake about it, madam. That folly is over. The people wait today for a revelation.
Buchan drew on his own knowledge of military intelligence and was the first author to set his adventures against the backdrop of real events in the war.
You may kill us, if you can, but we shall at least have crushed a lie and done service to our country.
Despite the odds, Hannay and his team overcome the German menace and return victorious.
It's the famous five, isn't it? I mean, he'd blighted stolen it all. Do you think it's the famous five joining him at the Foreign Office, isn't it?
Hannay's group of chums in fact represented something fundamental to Buchan. The First World War instilled in him a strong wartime sense of comradeship. The idea of a close-knit group of dependable companions was one that Buchan held dear.
Crick, old fella! God, Sandy Arbuthnot. Well, it is good to see you.
Of all the chums, it was Richard Hannay himself who truly captured the reader's imagination.
The honourable English gentleman, whose word is his bond. He behaves well in all circumstances. He's loved by his servants and inferiors. He's had a good education. He belongs to a good club. He gets on well with all his fellows under all circumstances. And he's not afraid to call a spade and to do what he thinks is right, no matter how heavy the opposition may be.
He has a very clear sense of right and wrong, Hannay. I don't think he has a great sense of humour, which is fine. I would like my spies generally not to waste too much time on gags and to get on with saving the country, which is by and large what Hannay gets on with without too much arsing around.
Buchan had a purpose for his characters that went beyond mere storytelling. As the destruction of the World War spread, he also used them to articulate the values he held most dear.
Buchan is right there in the middle, whether or not he's Sandy Arbuthnot or Richard Hannay, or whether he's a bit of both, or whether, a bit of him is in each of them. These are undoubtedly vehicles for his disquiet about the state of Britain as a power in the world, but also about the state of Britain itself.
By the beginning of 1917, war weariness was setting in Britain. The government, desperately worried about morale, set up a department for information. Buchan's literary talents found a new purpose. He was appointed its director and recalled from France.
He was given the job of starting the first Ministry of Information, and so it was intelligence work to some extent. But principally it was propaganda.
Yes, he did believe that what was being put across to people was a managed version of reality. I think he was quite conscious of this. And at the end of the war, he was, I think, in two minds about what the success of this had been. It had obviously been successful in certain respects, but it had also damaged the faith that people put in true reporting, in historical rationality.
In April 1917, Buchan's new public role was subsumed by private tragedy. On the morning of April the 9th, his younger brother, Alistair, a second lieutenant in the Royal Scots Fusiliers, led his company into action at the Battle of Arras. Almost immediately, he was hit by shrapnel. He died from his wounds in a field hospital that same afternoon.
Alistair, who was a delightful Very amusing, bubbly boy. And he was killed almost the minute he got there. Churchill wrote him a very nice letter about him. He was colonel at that time of the regiment.
Buchan learned of Alastair's death from his wife, Susan, who rushed to see him at the Foreign Office, bearing the fateful telegram.
When I got into his room, he sprang up, smiling to greet me. All my carefully prepared words deserted me, and I held out the telegram to him, simply saying, Alastair.
The couple returned home to receive a second shock. Another telegram awaited them, with news that Buchan's friend and business partner, Tommy Nelson, had been killed in the same battle.
All the people he cared for practically were killed, with a few exceptions. Not that this was at all strange, it happened to everybody. It was a dreadful war.
Within a period of 6 months, 4 or 5 of his very best and dearest friends were killed on the Western Front. And I think this marked him very powerfully and in a way lent force to his writing.
Though the war tested Buchan's imperial mettle to the limit, neither he nor Hannay faltered in their commitment to the war effort. Buchan's resolve, and his anxieties, would find expression in his next Richard Hannay novel, Mr. Standfast.
I have something to say to you, Richard Hannay. Are you willing to trust me?
Written in the last year of the war, it's a classic spy novel, with the hero employing the usual combination of courage, resilience, and true British grit to foil the seditious activities of a German spy ring operating behind Allied lines. But the threat in Mr. Standfast is not simply posed by a foreign power. Buchan also targets pacifism at home, which Hannay is sent undercover by his glamorous controller to investigate, using the alias of Cornelius Brand.
You won't live in an old manor like this, but among gimcrack little arty houses. You will hear everything you regard as sacred laughed at and condemned, and every kind of nauseous folly acclaimed. And you must hold your tongue and pretend to agree.
I detested my new part and looked forward to naked shame. It was bad enough for anyone to have to pose as a pacifist, but for me, strong as a bull and sunburnt as a gypsy, and not looking my 40 years, it was a black disgrace.
And Cornelius Brand, a.k.a. Richard Hannay, has to sort of dig his fingernails into his palms every time somebody voices anything against the Western Front. And he remembers choking back tears of all the gallant soldiers he's witnessed giving their lives.
And Buchan's job in real life is as director of propaganda to keep the war effort going. And I think in Mr. Standfast, he really pours out all his worries that it might not, and tries very hard to explain to his readers that while they may also have reservations, nonetheless, the war is worth it. It has to be fought out to the bitter end.
The finale of Mr. Standfast finds Hannay caught up in the bitter fighting as the war on the Western Front moves towards its end. His great friend, Peter Pienaar, dies heroically. It was perhaps Buchan's memorial for the numerous friends he had lost during the war.
I don't think either Buchan or Hannay were broken. I think they were worn out. That's different. Shell-shocked in the metaphorical sense of the word. I think that all that is true. I think seeking peace, seeking a quieter existence, but not, I would have said, broken.
He survived when many of his closest friends have died. There's a sense of being displaced, that all the dreams of that Oxford generation of his have gone. And it's interesting, for about 4 or 5 years after the war, he writes nothing except books, really, about the First World War. And I think there's suggestion almost of a nervous breakdown, certainly exhaustion.
In November 1919, Buchan found the retreat he needed, Ellsfield Manor, 4 miles north of Oxford. Susan had given birth to 2 more boys, William in 1916 and Alistair, named in memory of Buchan's younger brother, in 1918.
When he was at home, and any holiday time, he was absolutely perfect. He saw all the things we did, joined in various sports that we were interested in. He was one of those people who created an atmosphere around them which wouldn't allow for idleness or disagreeableness or anything of that sort. So in his company, we were always happy.
But the inner Buchan, so hard for those around him to detect, was constantly tormented by anxieties about the world beyond.
Buchan toyed a lot with that phrase, which has continually come up about the thin division between violence and order. And I think at the end of the First World War, he felt that humanity was no better at the end of it. Things had become a lot more problematic. The boil of violence had not been lanced. It had become actually more toxic than it was.
The Three Hostages, Buchan's first post-war thriller, portrayed the evil lurking beneath the New World. The adventure, Hannay's fourth, begins by finding him, very much like Buchan, enjoying the post-war calm in the Cotswold countryside.
Who's that?
I'm afraid it's McGillivray.
Oh, Lord.
It starts with this wonderful domestic idyll. You know, there they are at Foss Manor, they've got a baby and it's all marvellous and it's cosy and, you know, there's a fire burning in the grate and all that sort of thing.
You don't know what I want. To jockey me into some queer job where I'll make an ass of myself.
Now married with a young son, Hannay is drawn out of retirement to help the police solve a sinister crime.
Find 3 people, that's all. Before they're murdered.
Armed with only a few cryptic clues, Hannay must attempt to free 3 hostages, children of prominent figures, who have been kidnapped by a ruthless gang.
The important thing about that book is that it represents something that wasn't going to happen for some years to come yet, which was the kidnapping of the children of celebrated people for political purposes. I mean, that was really a horrible idea, but it came true.
A boy.
10 years old, the son of Sir Arthur.
The Three Hostages undoubtedly reflects anxiety about the post-war world. You have, once again, the enemy within, the corruption of morals, the lack of a sense of direction, the lack of sense of responsibility. These are the things that he sees there, and the ruthlessness of the people who wanted to tear down civilization and nothing to put in its place.
A foul racket!
There's no time, of course, for the decadent young of the 1920s, people who live for pleasure and who are disreputable and, you know, who have no moral fibre. There's the scene in the nightclub in The Three Hostages where you're just full of people like that, and Hannay is disgusted by them.
Let's go!
The book's villain, Dominic Medina, is shown to be all the more evil and dangerous because he is such an accepted figure in society.
When Hannay first suspects that Medina is a wrong-un, the immediate thing is nobody will believe that. You know, this man is admired everywhere.
After German spies and traitorous pacifists, the criminal Medina is the new enemy within.
Unless you wish to sleep. To sleep.
It was really terrifying, actually. I remember it being properly scary. Dominic Medina being a figure that recurred in nightmares for years afterwards.
Evil is evil in Buchan. The Three Hostages, you've got a very nasty man in Dominic Medina, a very nasty man indeed. Yes, I mean, there are echoes there of Biggles and Bulwark Drummond, I suppose, and as much as always, Hannay is very chivalrous. I mean, there's that bit where he actually tries to save Dominic Medina at the end, whereas your modern hero would have just, you know, let him go and been only too grateful.
Now, come on, let's go, take it.
There is for want of a better expression, an old-fashioned boy's own approach to that extent. Oh, but I think the works go way beyond that. They're about human weakness, they're about human wickedness, they're about the appropriate responses, they're about the triumph of good.
The literary life at Elsfield was, for Buchan, a sort of paradise. But his sense of duty and ambition tugged.
There's always a tension in both Buchan's own life and in his characters between public duty and private contemplation. And Buchan, I think, is drawn back into public life when he becomes an MP in 1937. And in the same way, Hannay is drawn from his country idyll, Foss Manor, to go back and do his duty for his country.
Buchan was elected Tory Member of Parliament for the Scottish universities. He expected to get into the cabinet, but would be disappointed.
He wanted office. I think he'd have liked to have been Secretary of State for Scotland, but he didn't get it. Partly he wasn't a good party man. He had a lot of friends on all sides of the House.
As a writer, Buchan continued to flourish. And within his prolific output, it is the thrillers which display a real prescience and modernity. But they are also of their time, and in recent years he has been accused of anti-Semitism, a charge that stems from views expressed by some of his characters.
The Jew is everywhere, but you have to go far down the back stairs to find him. If you're on the biggest kind of job and are bound to get to the real boss, 10 to 1 you are brought up against a little white-faced Jew in a bath chair with an eye like a rattlesnake.
He tends too much to be damned by people who just read 1 or 2 excerpts from his novel. It's, after all, Scudder who talks about everything in Europe being controlled by a little old Jew in a wheelchair with an eye like a rattlesnake. This is Scudder, the paranoid American, who's saying that.
That is then undercut and actually contradicted by Sir Walter Bullivant of the Foreign Office, true bluff British gentleman who says, oh, he used to believe a lot of nonsense. You shouldn't believe any of that stuff. It's not true.
He was actually a Zionist. I mean, his name is inscribed in the list of Friends of Israel. And in fact, it is very difficult for someone reared in Scots Presbyterianism to be anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, because the Scots Presbyterians, particularly the 17th century ones, almost saw themselves as a covenanted people, like the Israelites.
The evidence from Buchan's own words is conclusive. His letters from the 1930s castigated those in Britain who went along with Nazi vilification of Jews.
It is abominable at a time when the wretched Jews are suffering almost the cruelest persecution in history that Englishmen should give currency to these silly libels which are all invented in Germany.
When Hitler was lining up all the people he was going to kill when he came across, Buchan was on that list for his pro-Jewish activity. So I think it's very unfair to say he was anti-Semitic.
Despite Buchan's failure to get into the cabinet, the achievements piled up. He was created a Companion of Honour in 1932 and then appointed High Commissioner of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. His public life was crowned in 1935 when he was appointed Governor-General of Canada. He was made a peer, the first Lord Tweedsmuir of Elsfield. Just before he left Britain, there was a farewell treat. He and Susan were invited to the premiere of Alfred Hitchcock's film version of The 39 Steps.
Darling, how lovely to see you.
Hitchcock changed the story, added love interest, and subverted the ending. But Buchan's revolutionary thriller gave him the perfect inspiration.
I was desperate. I'm terribly sorry. I had to do it. Look here. My name's Hannay. They're after me. I swear I'm innocent. You've got to help me. I've got to keep free for the next few days.
Well, you've seen a man passing in the last few minutes.
This is the man you want, I think.
Hitchcock owed an enormous debt to Buchan.
There
go.
Buchan and Childers invented this form of storytelling, and Hitchcock is all about suspense. It's all about suspense. And of course, in visual terms, he was the all-time master of it.
What are the 39 steps?
The 39 Steps is an organisation of spies.
Hitchcock takes the deception, the disguise behind gentility, that kind of thing that Buchan had absolutely worked away at in his Hannay novels, and he refines it exquisitely, pares it down.
She was killed by a foreign agent who was interested too.
Did she tell you what the foreign agent looked like?
There wasn't time. No, there was one thing, part of his little finger was missing.
Which one?
This one, I think.
Sure it wasn't this one?
Hitchcock always said he enjoyed Buchan, he'd read all these novels. On the other hand, he also said that when he was adapting anything, he wasn't adapting it, he was redoing it, he was reimagining it for the screen. And there was this peculiar photograph of the two of them, Buchan looking like a heron, and Hitchcock looking like a small fish, looking very distrustfully at one another. But in fact, Buchan was said to have liked the adaptation.
Thought it was very good. A lot of intelligence in it, good ideas. My mother hated it. She thought it was an offence against a very good book.
But Buchan is entranced, and it's part of the sort of generous nature of the man that he actually liked it. He could see that in some ways it was very different, but very good. And he's determined to stay to the end to find out what happens.
Lord Tweedsmuir, Governor-General of Canada, visited President Roosevelt at the White House. The close feeling of kinship between Canada and the United States is a happy link in the chain of greater friendship between Britain and America.
Despite the demands of being a Governor-General and the duodenal ulcer which had made him a sick man, Buchan, as always, found time to write. He brought Richard Hannay out of retirement for a final adventure in the Island of Sheep.
It gets quite difficult to see this retired Major General, who's also an MP, dashing about doing heroic things on this Danish island.
The more I think about it, the more I feel it isn't part of a sequence. It's not really taking us anywhere, it's an adventure. It's good versus evil again. I don't think it has a particular significance.
Far more important was Buchan's last novel, Sick-Heart River, written in 1939, the year before his death. It's an unusually introspective book, in which Buchan reflects on his own life and achievements. The protagonist is Edward Leithen, the hero of his first venture into thrillers nearly 30 years earlier.
It's probably the most personal and profound of the books. Edward Leithen is told that he has a year to live, he has tuberculosis. And he's also asked to go and find François Galliard in the frozen north of Canada and bring him back. Leithen goes to this pastoral idyll, the Sick Heart, and finds him. And in doing so, he comes across these hare Indians who are dying, and he rescues them, but at, in a sense, the cost of his own life.
Sick-Heart River does give you a tremendously painful, gut-wrenching sense of what it is to be a very sick man in terrible physical conditions. And this was something he obviously saw from his own poor health at that time. But the notion of Leithen, who was suffering from TB, dying, going through these conditions in the northwest of Canada, is brilliantly envisaged. It is very much Buchan's last things, and it has that religious quality to it.
Well, Leithen, I think, begins as a conventional character almost. And of course, by Sick-Heart River, he has become Buchan's alter ego without a doubt. You know, how have I justified my life is the question. Have I justified my life? And of course, there he turns away from success and it's self-sacrificing.
I think Buchan himself never really knew whether Hannay or Leithen, right up probably until Sick-Heart River, whether Hannay or Leithen was his real hero. I don't think he knew himself. I think they were two sides of him. And I don't think he knew. And it would have been very easy as an older man to have looked back to the exploits of youth, which were very considerable in his case, and to have elected Hannay. Instead, he elects for Sitcart River the much more thoughtful, quiet guy, the duller guy, if you like. I think that's significant.
On the morning of February the 6th, 1940, John Buchan slipped in his bathroom and struck the back of his head on the edge of his bathtub. 5 days later, he was dead.
The one headline in the paper said, "Beloved Viceroy gone." And that's really all how I felt about it. They gave him this really magnificent funeral.
The body of the first Governor-General to die in office was placed in the Parliament buildings for the ceremonial lying in state. Thousands waited in the bitter cold to pay homage to his memory.
Buchan's death made front-page news around the world. His memorial service in Westminster Abbey had all the members of the cabinet, representatives of the royal family, and the editor of the Times said that he had never seen such an outflowing of grief for any man at that time.
Buchan, the grammar school boy from a modest home who became a Governor-General, achieved huge success in both public and literary life. But it's the thrillers that have made him endure.
Well, there are elements in Buchan's writing that have survived just because they're literary quality. You know, the idea of the enemy within, regardless of its political resonance, it's a literary conceit that just works so well. It's like the 12-bar blues. You can do it again and again and again, and it always sounds great.
Buchan not only inspired a century of British spy writing, he succeeded in isolating themes and stories that touch our world every bit as much as his.
Well, Greenmantle, of course, was due to be broadcast on Radio 4 last year, just after the July bombings, and the subject matter was thought to be so volatile and so close to the actual issue of the jihad that they felt it was insensitive to broadcast it, which I think, if that isn't telling, I don't know what is. I mean, that Buchan is still considered so contemporary, so contemporarily dangerous material. It shows that he was writing with fantastic prescience.
Oh, I think the ultimate tribute to any author is if decades after their death and a century after they were writing, that work is still considered not something which sits on a library shelf and is read by a student of literature, but rather as something that still has application to the mainstream of life. I mean, that is the ultimate tribute.
A quest to win heart and hand. Clash of the Titans, coming up next.